this whole Me Too movement in the context of Pakistan is something that the woman herself would draw ire.
You need more women in police stations, you need more women lawyers, particularly in rural areas, districts, in the tribal areas.
Women are not a priority, and violence against women is not a priority.
Culture in KPK where even passing a law becomes problematic. So the community remains silent when they talk about the issue of honor killing.
This is the third government when the domestic violence bill is pending in the assembly, and people are not willing to pass that.
Nimrita Kumari. Now, I'm scared even to say that it's a suicide. It is definitely related to the ideology of shame.
Cyber violence is not only taking its toll on the women, it is also taking its toll on the men.
The laws mustn't be theoretical and illusory, they must be practical and effective.
Speaking up itself invites a lot of public reaction, social reaction, there's male bonding, and there's often shaming.
Fighting the culture of shame and silence, violence against women. And all those on my panel are experts in the field of women's rights, and they will shed light on this. I will ask all my panelists, I'll begin with a discussion on, we will just focus on the culture of silence. All of you all respond to that how is it immersed in us, this culture of silence? And I'll give you 4 minutes each to talk about that, and how, when we try to, when there's protest, what happens when this culture of silence is addressed through protests. So within that framework, if all of you can respond to these questions, we will begin with that. So first, I would ask you to respond. Siobhan.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It's a great privilege and honour to be here at the Asma Jahangir conference, honouring the memory and legacy of Asma, who I'd met many times over visits and work in Pakistan, the first time in 1992. I think that's relevant to think back on time, because we're also this year celebrating 40 years of CEDAW, the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And if you look at the text of the CEDAW Convention, it is silent on violence against women, gender-based violence, domestic violence, no reference at all. And it wasn't until 1992 that the CEDAW Committee adopted its first general recommendation on violence against women, trying to break that silence, that violence against women, domestic violence, rape, was not something private, a domestic matter, either for a state or within families or communities, that it was a question of public justice, of rule of law, of human rights. More recently, we've seen in 2017 the adoption of a new general recommendation on the updated recommendation on violence against women from the CEDAW Committee, and also new recommendations on access to justice. And if we look at the recent concluding observations of UN human rights treaty bodies on Pakistan, they have focused in particular on questions around violence against women. So the UN Committee Against Torture, the UN Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, all issuing their recommendations in 2017, the CEDAW Committee 2016. They've highlighted the importance of making the legislative developments which have occurred in Pakistan, huge, significant legislative developments since I first started coming to Pakistan, but they have to be made practical and effective. It's a term that's used by the European Court of Human Rights in relation to domestic violence, violence against women. The laws mustn't be theoretical and illusory, they must be practical and effective. That means combating impunity and ensuring accountability. So when there is protest, when there are reports of domestic violence, gender-based violence, rape, gang rape, that there is no longer impunity and that there is accountability for the perpetrators of those crimes. But also, if you look at the work of the treaty bodies and what they're saying in relation to Pakistan, this reflects what human rights movements in Pakistan has been saying, what the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan has been saying, and many groups of women's rights lawyers, that you need more women in police stations, you need more women lawyers, particularly in rural areas, districts, in the tribal areas. You need to ensure that there are effective remedies and protection And this is key to checking what is the state doing in relation to its obligations of due diligence. And this is a legal obligation to prevent violence against women and domestic violence. But then when there are reports, why are women and girls not reporting? Because they're not getting protection and they're not getting effective remedies in part. So you need to track what happens when there are reports, how they are recorded, what's the response time, what kind of follow-up, what kind of remedies are being provided, and what accountability is there. And this is also about transferring the culture of shame elsewhere, to the perpetrators, to those who are not ensuring accountability. So changing the culture of the judiciary, the police, the practicing lawyers to promote accountability as a core aspect of rule of law. And this is something we've gone through in Ireland, also breaking that silence, breaking that shame, and putting the shame elsewhere onto those who are the perpetrators, but also onto the state in terms of its failures of accountability and failure of due diligence. Because you have human rights movements, huge effective human rights movements in Pakistan, the meetings of women lawyers from all over the country on Friday here. This is critical to growing a grassroots women's lawyers movement in districts, tribal areas, but they need support, they need protection, and they need support from the state and for those who are in positions of power. Thank you.
Now I'll move to my next panelist, if you can also respond to this question.
Siobhan very well captured the international context. So my context is basically national and the provincial, because this is very much linked with our current situation. For example, when we talk about the culture of shame and silence, so this is not just because of few people, culture or tradition. This is basically structurally inbuilt in our legislative framework, at the same time in our own institutional support available, because whenever we talk about the issue of violence, so the government should come across from their own, for certain reactions from own community. Then the legislative process, why we say there is a silence about women, and this is not just the silence, there is a resistance. If we are talking about the resistance against any progress legislation, so the current two legislative a pending bill in the KP Assembly are the example. For example, child marriage restraint bill, still we are struggling to get the minimum age for the child, and the second, the domestic violence bill. And this is the third government when the domestic violence bill is pending in the Assembly, and people are not willing to pass that, as particularly in the Assembly. Not only the conservative religious conservative political parties are resisting, there are people within the current setup, they don't want to have domestic violence act in the province, because the resistance they are doing in the name of religion, but you know that you can easily use the religion. And when you get some legislation, if you get some legislation all after facing this resistance and opposition from even from the government, and at the same time the advisory institutions, so the people sitting in the administrative setup or a duty bearers, they are also carrying lot of biases. They are not willing to respond or facilitate, especially the women survivor and the cases of gender-based violence and harassment. So they are not willing to support, because they believe if women is coming to the police station and she's basically creating a problem for not only for herself, but also because the burden of shame lies on women because a woman has to carry the name of the family, then the name of the community. Because, you know, if the women died or killed in a publicly, you never heard any voice from the community, from these religious group. But if the women resist any cultural violence, any sort of oppression in the family, it become issue of honor for the entire community, for own relatives, and at the same time, if she cross all the barrier and go to any police station, so it's become the issue of honor for the state as well. I still remember in this year, in February, when I started my office, because I'm the first ombudsperson in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So the women from very upper class, they took 1 month to file their application against harassment. They were, every second day, they were calling, they were coming, but they were so scared from media and their own family status. If this, if somebody knows, they file a complaint of harassment with the ombudsperson, so might be there is some problem or the shame for the family because they are from a very elite class. And then the last thing we can say that if there is some support available from the state, the infrastructure is so weak and under-resourced, so you can imagine. Only I just want to conclude on some figures. For example, in Punjab, you can see the result of silence and shame. So in Punjab, Human Rights Commission of Pakistan reported in 2018, 3,860 women were killed, 5,320 cases were reported under harassment. In Sindh, 1,643 cases of murder. In KP, 202 cases of murder, 24 cases of overall GBV, and then 97 cases of honor crime. So you can imagine, and at the same time, when we are talking about women, in KP, situation of transgender is also not good, and people are completely silent. And if you are talking about the shame, so the 19-year-old trans killing by her own father and uncle just in the last month is the worst example of shame and silence in our region, where people, they are not willing to face or a third gender in their family. That is also matter of shame for them. So there are cases that 19-year-old case was not the only case. There were some other cases where people kill their own daughters or son because of trans. Thank you.
Nafisa?
Silence or shame. मेरी अपनी स्टडी जो उस्मा आपने मिस किया, my own study, I'm also an academic apart from being a politician, and my study or my personal journey has been preoccupation or let's say involvement with a social issue which is of course related to social stigma, and that is on a particular form of gender-based violence called karokari. It's honor-based violence, and in that, of course, I did study these ideologies of honor and shame. मैं समझती हूँ कि in values, honor or shame, we need to really look at them deeply. These values, there have been numerous studies on what is it about honor and what is it about shame that it leads to extreme forms of action. It leads to violence. It leads to different forms of cultural violence everywhere. So we really need to look at these terms in detail and understand how they affect or inform our behavior. At the outset, Shame, honor, these are complex ideologies, and they inform our own ideas about personhood. These are emotional, psychosocial, behavioral codes, and they often determine our social action. I want to invite you to think about two recent episodes. There was an incident about suicide in Mayo College, and it was a male suicide, and related to an issue of sexual harassment. This was a college lecturer who was accused of harassment, and his name was cleared informally, but he said, I want a formal clearance of my name. So this was a fear of shame. One can analyze it once one goes into the details. What is it about this whole issue that led him to commit suicide? A similar incident was Nimrita Kumari. Now, it is, of course, very, very contested. I'm scared even to say that it's a suicide, because there is the other narrative which says it was probably a murder. And perhaps there may have been a close link to either it being a suicide or a murder. But if, or apparently, as it is a suicide, it is definitely related to the ideology of shame, that particularly that a woman who's not with us anymore. And it's a self-imposed silence that both of them had, perhaps for this fear of the shame about their reputation and so on. So I think these are extremely powerful ideologies, and we really need to understand them in order to both understand cultural violence against women and our responses against these women, this form of violence. In many ways, if we look at the different kinds of violence in Pakistan, I would again keep talking about the cultural context of violence. So if you look at the honor-based violence, the very fact that we shame the victims, we call them black. Time is up.
No, we'll come
I'll
back
just, I'll just go through these different forms of violence, and then we can go to the second half later. So the very fact that you say you brand them socially, it's symbolic branding, these people are black, is an act of shaming them and then killing them. Domestic violence itself is a form of cultural sanction. And often those people, I know I'm in the parliament, it's been so difficult. In the national parliament, we passed it once in the National Assembly, but we could not, in the Senate, but we could not get it through the National Assembly because of this very powerful, again, a part of this ideology of social control through through putting women in line and women being whatever women are in the private space are a part of, male control. So the domestic violence is almost seen as something that is an entitlement of a man to put a woman in the behavioral line. Similarly, harassment against women at workplace is again a form of a social sanction. Now in that context, and I'll stop here and we can go into the next round, like as Gloria Steinem, this is a famous American feminist, she says that the harassment these harassment against women is something that was considered as a part of everyday life. So speaking up itself, and speaking up is necessary in order to challenge these forms of cultural violence. Some of them are opaque, some of them are diffuse, others are more visible, but speaking up against them is an act, is a challenge, it's something that in itself is something that draws public reaction. So speaking up becomes an issue itself. Whether you speak up, this whole Me Too movement in the context of Pakistan is something that the woman herself would draw ire. I want to talk about Tanzila Mazhar case. I want to name her because I think she was this strong woman who challenged her sexual harassment in PTV, but till today she can't find a job because she spoke up against sexual harassment. So there's the speaking up itself invites a lot of reaction, public reaction social reaction, there's male bonding, and there's often shaming for speaking up as well. I'll end up here, and then we can perhaps go in the next round.
I don't have much to say, which is not going to be repeating what has been already said, because all the three speakers have really captured what our problem is. I just want to come at it with a slightly different angle. First of all, I want to give a clear message that violence is pervasive. It is here. It takes a few prominent forms, which is physical, and Nafisa talked about them, physical. There is sexual, and then a new and rising form of violence, which is, well, it's not a new form of violence, but it's being recognized more, is the psychological violence, you know. And the psychological violence has a very adverse impact. It's pernicious. It goes on throughout your life, brings your confidence down, and prevents you from achieving your maximum potential. It is also more dangerous because the threshold doesn't arrive where you decide, okay, I'm going to put an end to it and I'm going to move out because, you know, my bones were broken, I was beaten. So it's like we women, we go through life in the form of a boiled frog theory, and I'm going to just explain it to you. You know, when you put a frog in boiling water, it's going to instantly jump out of the boiling water, because that's what you do when you have such a strong reaction or such a strong experience. But if you put a frog in warm water and start hiking up the temperature, it's probably going to stay there till it dies, you know. And the psychological violence, I feel, is that boiling of water slowly, heating the water slowly to the point that you die and you don't jump out because you feel it's not acute enough to be able to invoke the need to get out of the situation. And that, I guess, has been proven very clearly, because recently a survey was done in Punjab, and I hope that other provinces will also do it, where we found that this was the highest. You know, about 34% women reported psychological violence. And 34% is a very large number, and these are people who normally wouldn't understand perhaps what, you know, rural areas everywhere, but they understood it so clearly that this was bringing them down that they reported it, and they reported it in a manner which explained to you that this was impacting their lives. Women who reported physical violence, I mean, that was also about 20%, which is a very large percent. Although we do know that the percentage of a slap here and a slap there is much more. I think the 20% was women who only said that, you know, they were beaten severely enough to be able to report it. Anyway, so I just wanted to establish the fact that violence is here. It is pervasive. It cuts across geography. Women in rural areas, urban areas, they all experience violence, albeit women in urban areas are reporting it more. And I guess that is the thing that I wanted to talk about. Education has an impact on a woman's reporting, you know. And that is also clearly proven that women who have, among the women who experienced violence, those who reported it more had a higher education level, you know. The lower you went down, the acceptance of violence increased as you went down in the education levels, you know, in the education levels. So that is probably something that we will need to tackle if we want to. And I think we are going to talk about the solutions a little bit later, because I have a lot of those also. The other thing is that the messaging from the state, it is very clear that women are not a priority and violence against women is not a priority, you know. And that messaging can be very overt in the form of rejection of all bills that are put to curb violence against women or domestic violence, especially, as Rakhshanda was talking about. In Punjab, we experienced that the message that was given by the religious element was that if you pass a law against domestic violence, we'll come out on the streets and we are going to bring your government down. You know, it was that strong. And we were very lucky that we passed a law still, and Sindh also passed the law, so two of the provinces have been lucky, but I know that the same law was turned down recently in the KP Assembly. So the state sends you the message clearly that this, we are not going to make it into priority because of the fact that the entrenched interest and the patriarchy against it is too alive and well. Whenever state takes actions, the women tend to start talking about their violence or reporting violence much more, and that comes to my point of strong state institutions. Because in Punjab, Uzma talked about the fact that I was heading a women's commission for the past 5-6 years. In Punjab, my experience was a strong state grievance redressal mechanism and a strong state accountability mechanism encouraged a lot of raising a voice that Nafisa was talking about, But if you don't have those grievance redressal mechanisms, if you don't have strong accountability mechanisms, then people don't talk about it because they feel it's, it's going to be it's going to be falling on deaf ears. Finally, I just want to talk about the tools of violence quickly. Tools of violence are changing also, right? First, it was more, the domestic violence, physical violence was more pervasive. Now, cyber violence that we are all, I'm sure the younger people over here are strongly familiar with, that is increasing a lot. And cyber violence is not only taking its toll on the women, it is also taking its toll on the men. It is not being tackled effectively because of the fact, again, like I said, it's not a priority, but the toll on the families is great, and I have experienced that in my past, 2 terms, that men have committed, fathers have committed suicide because of the shame that is imbibed by them. The woman, of course, has the shame associated with this entire experience, but even the families come down. So that is also something I feel like we need to talk about when we come to solutions in our next round.
Siobhan talked about how there's silence in the domestic violence, on domestic violence in the convention, CEDAW convention. Even at that level, we see that. How do we combat impunity? Rakhshanda talked about the culture in KPK where even passing a law becomes problematic. So the community remains silent when they talk about the issue of honor killing. Nafisa, as she mentioned, she has written a whole, her book is on the issue of honor killing, and that is a very good study about this culture of, I would say, shame associated, and that is what leads to honor killing. So there's a social stigma, she said, in honor attached to Karokari. And she also talked about shame where it leads to suicide. So we hear of all these different forms of how it is affecting not only women but also men, also the third gender. And Fauzia also mentioned about, she's mentioned that the psychological abuse is also a very important aspect to look at. So I think I would like you all to just give, for 2 or 3 minutes response about, if we analyze that once we have this consciousness, we all realize that this is there, this shame and silence. What are the factors behind this? I mean, can you just, each of you respond a little, give an analysis on this? And then we can find a way forward from our discussion.
One of the contributing factors that I earlier talked about was ineffective accountability and redressal mechanisms. The survey that I was talking about that showed that about 51% women among the women who experienced violence, 51% women did not tell anyone, not their families, not the state institutions, And of those women who experienced violence and who did report to someone, only about 1.8% reported to the police. And that was, by the way, the highest because sometimes when there's physical injury, then the police reporting is much more. Much less to the local cultural institutions. We have people, religious scholars, we have union council officials and all. The reporting to those officials was much less because of the fact that there wasn't confidence perhaps in that. We didn't go into the reasons, but the assumption is that the confidence in those institutions was very little. So if you have only 1.8 women reporting to the police, that tells you that your system is broken somewhere, out of that, Similarly, when those who did go to the police, they said, many of them through the helpline that is available in Punjab, which is specifically dedicated to women, many of those reported that the police response was not satisfactory. The police either did not listen to them, or they were very insensitive, or they did not file an FIR, because I'm talking about cases which merited the filing of an FIR. Here, the helpline, which is another institution I feel of accountability, that helped because that was an accountability mechanism for the police officials to tell them that if you have to address this issue. It is low on your priority because A, it's a woman who's reporting, B, women generally don't have the financial means to influence the police. So therefore, because of the police corruption also, it is imperative that the state institutions back those women. And when we went back, the police did take cognizance of those issues. So it's important then, I feel like if we're addressing factors to factor in the accountability of states that earlier Siobhan had also talked about. The other factor that I feel we need to address is the male perception of women's empowerment. Because that question, when you ask them directly, when you ask them a question directly about how do they feel about violence against women, is it okay to beat women up? The response is overwhelmingly no. It's not okay to beat women up, depending, of course, which area you're in, because it's going to vary from Lahore to perhaps Rajanpur. But the response is no. Is it okay, or is it advisable for girls to be educated? The response, about 70%, is yes. Girls should be educated. But if you approach the same question or the same issue differently and ask them, do you feel like women and girls need permission from their family members to study or to take up a job? About 86% said yes, they need permission. So when that permission is not invoked or is not taken, then that leads to violence against women also. So the male attitudes towards women's empowerment, girls' empowerment, that is a critical factor, and that is a complex phenomenon because it cannot be approached through direct discussions of violence. It has to be approached in different manners where you're invoking girls' education and its connection with not requiring, for instance, permission. I know that I'm giving a lot of statistics, but the DHS shows, the Demographic and Health Survey of Pakistan, it shows that it was about 49% men who felt that it was okay to beat a woman if she went to even her parents without asking permission of the husband. That's a very large percentage. So I think I'll just let it be and let others talk about it. These two factors that I've talked about, strong accountability mechanisms and grievance redressal mechanisms, and tackling male perception of women's empowerment, these are the two factors that need to be addressed.
I think it's the pervasive moral ideologies of or in the society. What is the proper behavior for women? What is the proper behavior of men? Masculinity is reinforced when you, control your women, when you, become a vigilante if there is any transgression. Femininity is about staying silent, about, it's about being in the proper line of behavior. So these are the social moral codes, I think, and if you defy them, if you transgress them, then violence is something that is almost sanctioned. And interestingly, the state has not, yes, of course, we have a constitution, we have a modern law, we have the laws that restrain this activity, and yet when it comes to the court of law, and I think you would all bear me out, that these cultural ideologies do affect the judges, they do affect the lawyers. So for instance, in honor crimes, I've seen that the settlements that happen over murders of men and women killed for honor is something that happens outside the courts, in the jirgas, and inside the courts, through the judges. And then there are laws that enable these ideologies to, for instance, the Qisas and Diyat law is something that allows settlements over murder. So let me give you some examples where the acts of violence were sanctions for certain forms of defiance. For instance, Kandil Baloch, she was killed because she provoked the society, and she challenged the society. She provoked the female proper behavior. She defied that. And that actually provoked revulsion in the society. Generally, I think it was a collective murder, in a way. Abda, because there was, I would see that on the social media, I would see the kind of revulsion that was, articulated by a lot of people commenting on, however she wanted to project herself. Abda and Tehmeena, this is my study. In my study, these were two women who were killed because they eloped and they married of their own free will, which is something that law allows. But they were killed because they eloped. They challenged the norms of proper behavior, what it is to be a woman. They could only marry in a structural sense, and if you marry of your own free will, you invite trouble. Afzal Kohistani. This is one of the most heartbreaking stories of recent, this is again, then I would want to recontextualize this as gender violence in this context. Because Afzal Kohistani is someone who spoke against the collective murders that were silenced. I don't know how many of you remember there was an incident in Kohistan where there was a video leak of women and men who were this was a wedding and they were listening to music together and women were clapping. So this is something that defied collective honor. The women were killed. I'm not sure if a man was killed along with them, but 3 women were killed. And then there was the Supreme Court took notice. There was, interestingly, there was a social silence around those murders. So when the team went to investigate whether these women were actually killed, the local officials also hid this fact that they were killed. And the initial report that went from women activists to the Supreme Court said there was no killing, the women were alive, whereas actually they were dead. And who spoke, who actually defied the social silence, the silence of the officials, is this one man, Afzal Kohistani. And yes, I'm done. And what was the result? Years later, he was chased and he was killed. So these are the various forms of how, how pervasive these ideologies are. And of course, the solution is to challenge these ideologies, but also to do them within the framework of law, and we can come back to that.
In KP, when they announced 57 women desks at each police station to help out women, then there was no resources to continue with the 57 police stations. Only 10 police stations were offering last year for support for women from the police station because they were supported from the donor money. So, the one of our analysis is with the support system available to deal such cases is basically highly donor dependent, because when your justice system and your violence against women or overall human rights issue is not the strong commitment and not get enough resources within the annual development budget, then you are dependent on the donor, and the donor always they are very careful. For example, we resisted some of the donor driven program where again they were going into the traditional setup, because encouraging jirga, encouraging alternative dispute resolution with the cover of culture. When we say cover of culture, so people sitting in the ADR are behaving like the person already they are doing dealing with the cases with very typical patriarchal and tribal mindset like jirgas. So the promotion of jirgas, either these are the peace jirgas or the jirgas set up to settle family dispute. For example, in the KP Police Act, the dispute resolution committee's decisions are highly controversial because they are dealing with you can see on the KP Police website, so many cases dealt with DRCs, but no one tried to dig out the main reason how they are, every second day they are having mediation under the very old traditional setup. So, you know, the Masalati Jargas and the dispute resolution committees and the women representation is not enough. There are number of committees where women are completely absent, and the people sitting in these institutions, they are again carry their biases and reflecting their own. And the final thing I just want to add about, you know, the pro-women legislation. We salute our women parliamentarians. They raise women issues in the parliament, and we got women legislation. But what about when we still have Hudud ordinances, we still have Qasas and Diyat, we still not willing to accept the age of 18. So then what the use of the pro-women legislation? So my recommendation is the women agenda should be included in a, because there should be a special budgetary allocation for to address such issues. And the second, the institution should be set up under the international human rights standard, because now the government of Pakistan is signatory of major human rights treaties. And the last, there is a need for a strong implementation of national action plan, because the people most of the time they keep silence on the issue, because they don't want to agitate or take any stance against religious group, because they know very well if they take any stance, they can easily blame with blasphemy, or maybe there will be a strong reaction.
The absence of the rule of law in relation to violence against women and domestic violence is key, because it suggests that this is something different. So the ordinary rule of law doesn't apply. So we've already heard the problem about unjust laws. The process of reforming law is incomplete. In terms of enforcement, there are significant gaps. And we see parallel systems continuing, so Qisas and Diyat, the parallel justice systems continuing in practice, the lack of accountability and lack of enforcement. That reinforces shame, because when women do come forward and report, what are they met with? There's fear of retaliation, killing, assassinations, executions. There's also a lack of alternatives, so economic dependency. Where else is there to go if you are entirely dependent on the family and community who are insisting that you stay and that you are bringing shame by reporting? Psychological violence is key, because that again reinforces shame over a long period of time. And in a number of jurisdictions in Europe, in Ireland, for example, we've just criminalised coercive control. That's linked to the Council of Europe, Istanbul Convention, references to psychological violence, CEDAW's work on that, looking at the impact of that over time. Psychological violence, as Fauzia said, and coercive control as being linked to the lack of accountability and impunity for violence. So in terms of the remedies, we need a continuing process of law reform, but most important, we need accountability, ending impunity, and we need exit strategies for women and girls, so that there are alternatives. There's no longer dependency, economic dependency, because violence against women and domestic violence also is about power. It's about an exercise of power and inequality, and we need to ensure that the laws are fit for purpose. It was mentioned just yesterday, Michelle Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, spoke about the digital world as being there an apparent absence of rights. We need to ensure that our laws are fit for purpose, but most importantly, that they are enforced on the ground, and that this culture of shame is not reinforced by impunity and a lack of accountability and a lack of resourcing for women in police stations, for women in the judiciary, for women lawyers in rural areas, so that they are supported in combating impunity. Thank you.
The first thing really we need is for these pervasive moral or behavioral codes to sort of be challenged. I think we need clear social change. And for me, the first thing that would lead to social change is more empowerment for women. And for that, I think our equalities law, I would begin with changing the fundamental rights, strengthening the fundamental rights equalities law. So there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex, there should be no discrimination on the basis of gender, there should be no discrimination on the basis of marital choice, there should be no discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, there should be no discrimination on the, expand the scope of equalities so that you have more rights for women enshrined in the basic law. And of course, there are plenty of laws that are vague, that leave space or that actually allow immunity or impunity for the culprits. For instance, I talked about how Pakistan's murder laws allow private justice. They allow, and I want the lawyers to think about this, that right now the legal powers of resolution over life and death are shared between the state and the wali. And who is a wali? A wali is a private member of a family, according to our personal law. So mother, father, sister, daughter. So when there is a killing within the family, if the daughter has been killed, the mother's, by the brother, the mother and the father can forgive the brother. And although it's not happening in the context of honor killings now after the legal changes, but then who defines what is honor killing? How would you in the court of law say that this is an honor killing when it's not registered as an honor killing? So the law is vague. The law needs to change, and these changes, of course, domestic violence law. For domestic violence law, you need an ideological understanding that family is important. I understand families are very important. The state says we shall protect the families, but families are not sacred. So if there is violence against women within the family, the state should be able to perforate that particular, wall that beyond, within which all this violence is taking place. So I think we need multiple changes, empowerment of women, generally legal change, victim support, and most importantly, speaking up. I think we have to encourage men and women to speak up wherever and whenever they see these forms of violence.
We need to encourage those who have spoken up. And one way to do that is to monitor the use of laws that support women or that condemn and deal with violence against women carefully in courts. We know that laws have been passed in Punjab and in Sindh, but how many cases have been reported against those? And when they do get reported, what happens to those? So careful monitoring of that and supporting the victim, because I remember a case where there was a young woman, she came to the commission to ask about support for her case where she had reported rape, She was raped and she asked for support because the police wasn't listening and all. And that helped us understand the challenges that a woman faces in navigating the system. From the reporting to the medical legal examination to the police constantly asking them to come to the police station, to asking them on the road how their case is doing, disregard for confidentiality, complete disregard for confidentiality, to the re-victimization of the victim in court and the shame that she's put through in court. All of that has to be monitored. Those systems have to be improved, and I'm really glad that Supreme Court gave a strong judgment in 2014 in a Rawalpindi gang rape case of a 13-year-old girl against the government of Punjab, and in that very clear guidelines were given as to how every criminal justice institution should behave. And in response, in Punjab, dedicated courts to deal with gender-based violence are being, one was established, and now the Chief Justice of Pakistan, Supreme Court of Pakistan, has announced setting up of dedicated model courts for dealing with violence against women, the gender-based violence courts. I feel like these dedicated institutions are going to be very helpful. Another thing, an important thing, we have to increase the critical mass of women in every institution, not just in criminal justice institution, where the numbers are extremely low because the numbers of women police are less than 1% across Pakistan. In Punjab, they're about 3%, but they're less than 1% in Pakistan, you know. The number of women medical legal officers, there are very few, so therefore overburdened and poor responses generally. The number of women in leadership positions in any institution, among the bars, you've noticed how few women there are, and among the ones who are, there is perhaps just about 5% leadership in, you know, bar associations and all. Women only comprise 5% of the leadership. So increasing the critical mass of women so that they can support each other and they can collectively raise the voice of women. Thank you. That's all I want to say. Thanks.